So Election Day begins tomorrow, believe it or not necessarily here in Louisiana, but primary season is upon us nationally, which is going to be half of what I want to talk about today. The other half of what I want to talk about today are the 2019 statewide elections in Louisiana, more specifically as it pertains to the anticipated legislative turnover next year when term limits take over. So the first thing I want to talk about are the 2018 midterm elections. And there's been a lot of spin, in my opinion, about what is ultimately going to happen this November, where people will cherry pick polls or cherry pick spin that comes from political operatives who are desiring a certain outcome. So you're getting contradictory stories as to what's going to happen. So to kind of put some of that aside, I'm going to use 4 data points that actually have nothing to do strictly with polling to give you a more balanced assessment of what I see as happening this November. The first of those 4 data points, and again, no polling data in this analysis of the national elections. One of the things I'm looking at are changes in partisan voter registration. In other words, if the thought is that there's going to be a Democratic wave, that one would expect to see more and more people registering Democratic and/or less and less people registering Republican. So to determine if that is or is not the case, what I looked at was in 23 states where you have partisan registration and the Secretary of State are kind enough to periodically give us updated voter registration data, I looked at what's happened to the changes in voter registration data since Donald Trump was inaugurated as president, because theoretically since January of 2017, if some of the pundits are correct, you would expect to see a wave of Democratic voter registration. I did not see that. More specifically, what I saw happening was that when we're talking about out of a denominator of 93 million voters, I have seen 1 million less Democrats registered to vote, 570,000 less Republicans registered to vote, and an uptick of 416,000 independents. So in other words, from that standpoint, no Democratic wave. The second thing that I think is worth looking at is what I generically refer to as party enthusiasm. In other words, one of the things I feel strongly about is that the seeds to a partisan wave can typically be detected during primary season. So one of the things I've been looking at is partisan participation in primaries. We in fact have had 2 so far, believe it or not, Texas and Illinois. Tomorrow we have 4 more. In fact, if I'd had my druthers, this would be the type of conversation for me to have with y'all in early June when we will have nearly half of the primaries over. But be that as it may, I can tell you that from looking at Texas and Illinois' primaries, and by the way, this is looking at Democratic and Republican participation in those primaries relative to what they were in 2014 when you had both parties with competitive primaries on the ballot. Using that metric, what I saw happening in Illinois and Texas was that Democratic participation increased 119% relative to the 2014 midterms. Republican participation increased 4%. That matters very much because when you look at what happened in the 2010 and 2014 midterms, what I saw happen was that in the aggregate, where there was 19 states where I saw contested Democratic and Republican Party primaries during primary season, in the aggregate, 57% of those in the 2010 midterms voted in the Republican primaries. In 2014, 63% voted in the Republican primaries. Those were wave elections, as you may recall. Another thing I noticed too, in addition to the triple-digit increase in Democratic primary enthusiasm, was the swing state of Virginia. What I saw happen is in the 2016 primaries, 43% of voters picked a Democratic ballot, 60% did in the primaries last year. So from that standpoint, when you're talking about partisan enthusiasm, I am clearly seeing evidence of Democrats being more enthusiastic about voting than Republicans, which means that you can theoretically talk about the W word, wave. So this month we have 11 party primaries. Tomorrow, 4 of those 11 are occurring. I personally think they're fascinating because I follow politics in 49 other states, in addition, of course, to what's going on here in Louisiana. You have primaries going on in Indiana, North Carolina, Ohio, and West Virginia. And what I think personally is fascinating about those primaries tomorrow is that in 2 states, you have incumbent Republicans or Republican establishment types running against each other and cutting each other up, while you have a third candidate who's basically the outsider trying to claim the mantle of the Donald Trump voter. So it'll be interesting to see what will happen in those matchups, particularly since one of those candidates, in this case in West Virginia, has been fairly controversial by using racially tinged language that's shocking quite a few people. The question is if that is similarly offensive to West Virginia Republican primary voters. The other thing I think is important, and this again is along the lines of what I would call party enthusiasm. Wayne Gretzky once said that you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. Accordingly, another thing I like to look at when we're talking about party enthusiasm is that in 35 states thus far, qualifying has closed for congressional primaries. Louisiana's, of course, were the last in the nation mid-July. But in those 35 states where filing has closed, what I have seen happen is that 99% of 212 Republican seats have a Democratic competitor. 80% of 154 Democratic seats have a Republican competitor. In other words, what's going on is nearly every Republican-held seat has a Democratic challenger, but 20% of Democratic-held seats are basically skating on Election Day. So when you have that degree of Democratic enthusiasm going on where they're contesting nearly every Republican-held seat, in my book, I call that evidence of party enthusiasm, and the fact that they're competing for those seats means that they may be able to pick up some that they would not have had they left those seats alone. Thus the Wayne Gretzky remark. The other thing, again, when you're talking about things I'm looking at, this is actually point number 3 with regards to data points that are or are not indicative of a party wave. I look at the metric of congressional retirements. The thing I've seen about politicians is that, or politics in general, it's a very psychologically driven profession, meaning that either the fear of what you saw just happened in a past election or the fear of what may happen in an upcoming election typically forces incumbents' hands in terms of retirement. Along those lines, what I'm seeing happening thus far, and keep in mind, this is with only 35 out of 50 states where congressional filing has closed, I'm seeing a record number of congressional retirements of 39 Republicans and 17 Democrats. The Democratic number is typical. 39 Republicans, that's a record. I've not seen numbers that high for some time. The last time I saw them even close was in 2008 when Republicans, after coming off of a big defeat in the 2006 midterms and faced with the prospect of a Barack Obama-led wave in 2008, decided to retire en masse. Now, I had mentioned that 17 Democrats had retired. The highest number of Democratic retirements I've ever seen was back in 1992 when 42 decided to retire, and that was due to a combination of things such as a house banking scandal, reapportionment, provisions in the law that would allow them to keep their campaign money if they retired that year, et cetera, et cetera. But it's also worth noting that in 1996, when Democrats were coming off of a disastrous 1994 midterm election, that 29 of them decided to retire. So in other words, putting those up against the 17 Democrats who have decided not to run for re-election this year suggests to me that they're staying put because they feel that good things are about to happen this fall. The fourth factor when we're talking about what I see as happening this fall in the midterm elections are, I'm looking at the special elections that have occurred thus far, because there has been pretty much ever since the spring of 2017 a series of special congressional elections with 2 more to come this fall, one in Ohio and one in Texas. What I've seen happen is that in those congressional special elections, the Republican congressional candidate has run 6 to 9 percentage points behind what Donald Trump received in the 2016 presidential election. The reason that that number is particularly significant is that increasingly I have seen more and more evidence of straight ticket voting, meaning that the way a person votes in a presidential race typically is how he or she is going to vote in down ballot races such as Congress. So if we're having a significant drop-off in support for these congressional Republicans, that to me is indicative of bad things to come in November. And let me give you some statistics just to illustrate to you what I think is, from the Republican standpoint, bad. Right now you have 42 House Republicans who are sitting in seats where Donald Trump got less than 50% of the vote. So if you do the simple mathematics, less than 50% of the vote takes 6 to 9 more points off of even that low number. That's pretty bad. Furthermore, 107 Republicans are sitting in seats that Donald Trump got 56% of the vote or less, while 139 Republicans are sitting in seats where Donald Trump got 59% of the vote or less. Only a handful of Democrats are similarly impacted in terms of sitting in seats where Donald Trump received a majority of the vote. Those handful of seats are in Minnesota and Pennsylvania. So what I'm illustrating here is that given the Democratic enthusiasm that has manifested itself in terms of their outperforming, or rather, depending on if you're a glass half empty, glass half full kind of person, Republicans underperforming what Donald Trump did, we have not yet had a special election that has been held in territory where you have a Republican congressional district where Hillary Clinton carried it. There's going to be 24 of those this fall. So looking at that type of data, that to me indicates things that Republicans should be very concerned about with regards to the U.S. House elections this fall. Now, one of the things that has been bandied about, and my job is either to prove or disprove it here today, people think that the Republican Senate is rock solid and nothing can happen to it because of the fact that you have 3 times as many Democrats up for re-election as you do Republicans. Well, to tell you the truth, when I look at the individual races that are going on, I personally see 6 to 7 Republican seats that are vulnerable. And the reason I'm saying 6 to 7 is, with all due respect to Senator John McCain, we do not know if that's going to be another open seat this fall given his condition. On the Democratic side, I see 7 seats that are potentially vulnerable. The way I look at those seats, however, is that in each one of those situations, either the Republicans are self-immolating or the Democrats are adequately funded or running strong campaigns. So in other words, I'm not necessarily expecting in the United States Senate that you would have a substantial pickup of Democratic-held seats. At best, maybe 1 to 2, but given that you have 6 to 7 vulnerable Republican seats, I think it is certainly part of the dialogue that the Republicans could lose control of the U.S. Senate in addition to the U.S. House come this fall. So that's what I see happening nationally. I'd like to shift gears and talk about legislative turnover next year because, of course, we're about to go onto the upswing of the electoral cycle, where after a relatively dry year last year, we're going to have midterms this year. Of course, we'll have congressional and a few other races here in Louisiana this fall. Then next year, of course, is the cornucopia of politics with all the statewide elections. 2020, of course, Senator Cassidy's up for re-election. You have congressional races, DA's races, judges' races, and by the way, the presidential race. So as we're about to go into the upswing of the political cycle again, what I thought was an interesting discussion was the legislative turnover in 2019. My attitude about the legislative turnover in 2019 is, yes, it is substantial, but it's not as substantial as you might think. More specifically, out of a legislature of 144 people, 49 are currently term limited. There are 33 in the House and 16 in the Senate whose political careers in that chamber end next fall. And what's kind of interesting when you look at those 33 and 16 is most of those are Republican seats. However, in Louisiana, given that Republicans have taken some time to become a more dominant party, I'm not expecting the Democratic wave that I see happening nationally to hit here in any way, shape, or form. In fact, I would expect, based on where those term-limited seats are, that the Republicans have a chance to break even or pick up one in the U.S. State Senate, rather, and pick up 3 to 5, in my opinion, in the State House. Here's one of the things I think that a lot of you don't know, and I think it's important to point out. So while everybody's pointing out about the sheer volume of term limiteds, particularly in the House, what I think is an important statistic here is while there are 33 of them who their political careers in the House are ending next fall, there's actually a bigger term-limited class in 2027 of 39 of them. And the reason there's that disparity, which hasn't really been talked about much until really just now, is that ever since the House convened a couple of years ago, there have been 7 special elections, and these are generally of people who would have been term limited next year. So in other words, those 7 people who may have had open seats next year, well, whoever is in those seats now or will be in those seats this fall, because of course we have 2 more House special elections going on, they're not due until at least 2027 or 2031. So point being is the turnover is large, but it's not as large as you think in the House. It's really more of the Senate where you're going to have a volume of incumbents who are going to be term limited. The thing which I think is important to appreciate when you're talking about the climate of term limits and accordingly Governor Edwards' re-election chances is that the political complexion of Louisiana has steadily been getting more Republican since he was elected governor. More specifically, when I took a look at voter registration changes, which to me is basically at a very granular level the best way of looking at what people are generically thinking. Since Governor Edwards was first elected, there are 41,600 less registered Democrats in the state. Of that 41,000 figure, there are 54,400 less white Democrats. In other words, there's been a 9% attrition in 2.5 years. Republicans have picked up 77,300 members since Governor Edwards was first elected. Independents have picked up 18,300. So really the point of what I wanted to talk about today was kind of lay out to you, using data and not spin and or the poll du jour, is what's going on not only nationally for the midterm elections this fall, but to give you an early glimpse of what I see happening, particularly as it pertains to legislative turnover in next year's elections. And having said that, I'd be more than happy to take any questions. Yes?
There is some of us in the Louisiana Legislature that the Republicans are attempting to take even more of an advantage next 2 election cycles by scheduling reapportionment at the same time that these elections are scheduled. Do you anticipate that as being a real threat to any upswing in Democratic elections, or do you see that as a trend that will continue?
So before I repeat the question verbatim, you're referring to Louisiana only?
Yes.
Okay, so what the question is, it's a really interesting question. It's talking about perhaps the Republicans maybe trying to gain undue advantage by, I guess, manipulating reapportionment, for lack of a better term. The way I look at that is this. So, as you know, the census is going to release new figures on April 1st, April 1st, 2020 is when the census will be taken. So, of course, all those questionnaires will be sent out. We'll be needing to answer them. There'll be follow-ups if you haven't answered them and so forth. The practical terms of the next reapportionment is this. Most likely, I would expect spring to summer of 2021, the revised census data to come back from the census. We don't have legislative elections until 2023. So technically, the legislature could decide either in 2021 or 2022 or 2023 to redraw its lines. So given that timeline, which by the way is way different than the timeline a decade ago when you had the census figures were released early for Louisiana because of course we had elections that very year. But given that you have kind of a more drawn out timeline for release of 2020 census data, anything's possible if you're talking about manipulation, but the practical reality is those would take effect on the 2023 census. So I'm not really sure what more could be gained, number one. And number two, in the House, the Republicans had a fairly good plan already, so there are not many more incremental gains they could make without starting to take away the tenures of some Black caucus members, which of course is a political non-starter. So the bottom line to answer your question is, anything is possible when it comes to reapportionment, since it is inherently a very political process, but I'm not personally expecting there to be much of a near or midterm impact. It'll be really more of a 2023 election kind of thing.
I'm also hearing that one strategy is to put forth legislation for a constitutional convention. Do you see that causing some waves in the scenario that I initially presented?
The question is about if the placing the constitutional convention, I assume you're talking about on the ballot in the near future. The way I look at that, though, is that, number one, the term constitutional convention is going to be an amorphous term for many voters. So to be able to excite many people, it becomes then a question of how do you sell it to the average voter? Because when you're talking about things in the constitutional convention, such as unlocking certain dedicated funds or perhaps changing the rules and what it takes to increase taxes, well, those kinds of contemplated changes create their own problems. So I'm not really seeing that as being much of an issue at this point. It really just depends on what the Constitutional Convention, would actually accomplish. Because anything they accomplish, there's going to be people who are going to like it and not like it. So, like I said, that's not something where I really see a substantial political impact unless they start substantially tinkering with the tax system and or changing dedicated funds. Yes?
Just a general public question. Does the federal representative get to keep his campaign funds and transfer them to private use? And is the prospect of them losing the election because it's so grueling, or because their secondary employment afterward would be impacted if they lost the election? Why would someone retire just because they're challenged?
So there's two halves to this question. One is regarding campaign funds, and one is, I guess, the fear of losing or being challenged. Now, when you're talking about specific uses of campaign funds, since I'm not a lawyer, I'm not quite going to get into the intricacies of that. But with regards to fear of losing, that certainly plays into the psychology I described, because one of the things I saw happening not only after the 2006 Democratic wave, but after the 1994 Republican wave, was that when all of a sudden you as the majority party lose power, there's really not a lot you can accomplish in the minority, and so that tends to accelerate people's plans for retirement. And incidentally, if you're talking about this year, the one person who potentially could be impacted by that would be Steve Scalise. Because as a minority, you don't have as many leadership slots as you do in the majority. So that would be certainly an interesting issue for him if the worst were to happen for the House Republican majority this year. Yes, John?
I think you said 39 Republicans are retiring from Congress. Out of those 39 districts, what percentage of those 39 do you know already going to be challenging? Are those districts really strong Republican districts?
So the question is, what is the partisan composition of the 39 House Republicans who have thus far decided to retire? It's all over the map, to be honest with you. Some are safe Republican seats, some are Democratic leaning, such as Ileana Ross-Lehtinen in Miami. So the thing is, it's a combination of those kinds of seats and Republican incumbents in seats that Hillary Clinton won. The sum total of those two are what the Republicans need to be worried about, but it's not like every single one of those 39 is a Democratic-held seat. There's some, but it's certainly not a majority. Yes.
You talk about voter enthusiasm on the national level. Can you bring us down to the state level? The governor's race last time, it was absolutely anemic, something like 29 or 32%. The treasurer's race is down to about 11%. Do you see much enthusiasm, and can you specify that some of that enthusiasm may be determination to vote against certain candidates, in particular the governor, that may motivate folks to go to the polls, or do you think it'll be just as anemic as it was 4 years ago?
So there's two halves to this question. It's pretty interesting. It's talking about really the level of enthusiasm and if that enthusiasm is driven by being more for or against somebody. going back to 2015, what I found was interesting was that Democrats were very enthusiastic. And my theory about the why part was this. Democrats have been out of power for 8 years, plus David Vitter was somebody who you either loved or did not like, which of course meant that Democrats would be more enthusiastic to vote against him. So partisan turnout in the governor's race was actually, I saw a black percentage of the electorate of about 30%, which actually was almost exactly what it was in the Mary Landrieu race. The interesting thing is, after those 2 election cycles, well actually 3 election cycles if you want to include the Barack Obama election of 2012 here in Louisiana, after those 3 election cycles where you saw an uptick in Democratic performance, the question is if that became the new normal with regards to statewide turnout. Well, along came 2016, and black turnout was about 7-8% less than white turnout in the 2016 presidential election. It fell further in the 2016 Senate race, then it spiked up again for the treasurer's race. The treasurer's race to me was a very specific circumstance because this is truly the first time you had a race that nobody was really interested in, but you had a medium interest race for the New Orleans mayor's race, which resulted in Orleans Parish casting over 20% of the statewide vote. Just to illustrate how huge that number is, if let's pretend in the Cassidy Landrieu race that 20+% of the vote were coming from Orleans Parish, I calculated that it would have been roughly a 50-50 race rather than the 56-44 victory that Cassidy had over Landrieu. So in other words, New Orleans was voting way out of proportion to its numbers, purely because it was the only game in town, so to speak, relative to the other races around in the state. When you're talking about voting for or against someone, I look at it this way. A lot depends on intensity of dislike or love. And so when you're talking about, and you have to look at that in terms of 2014 and 2015. So in 2014, Mary Landrieu had a time-tested get-out-the-vote apparatus, which she certainly tried to use to her benefit. However, the bottom had fallen out for her way back in 2009, in my opinion. In 2015, I think it was a case of, like I said, Democrats were incredibly energized because they'd been out of power for 8 years, and they were excited about the chance of taking the governor's mansion back, plus the fact that David Vitter was, a fairly partisan Republican. I think that contributed to strong Democratic turnout as well. Also, too, I think you can make an argument in the 2015 governor's race that after the thermonuclear war that was going on between the 3 Republican candidates, that if you had voted for Darden or Angel, there was probably a decrease in enthusiasm in showing up in the runoff. So it can have an impact, bottom line, with regards to how it goes on a statewide election by statewide election basis. It really depends. I mean, like I said, there were some assumptions I was thinking that were going to be the new normal after the 2012, 14, and 15 elections in Louisiana that were dashed in 2016. So the thing that I look at the most when you're talking about that, and again, this is looking at data points in advance, given that more and more Louisianians early vote, that is something I typically look at for guideposts as to what I think partisan enthusiasm will be. Because I clearly saw that in 2016, Democratic enthusiasm was way off relative to what it was in 2012. And since 25% of the vote was cast early, that's a pretty good predictor of what's going to happen with the other 75%. Yes?
You mentioned that there's a dramatic decline in the number of white voters registered as Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
Is that from people switching, or is that as olders roll off the polls and young people come on and become voters, that they're just checking Republican?
So the question is why it's asking about the breakdown of why there has been this 9% decrease in the number of white Democrats, which incidentally has been a consistent thing that I've seen over the years. I think it is as you described. So it comes in 2 parts. One is partially party switchers. The other 2 is attrition. I once did an analysis a few years ago that showed the average age of a white Democrat was 58 years old. So what you're talking about as time goes on, I think you still have a fairly significant portion of registered Democrats who they registered that way perhaps because that was the only game in town. And even though the open primary system is 4 decades old habits are hard to break. In other words, either you have to go down to the registrar of voters office to change your voter registration. It's kind of hard to get someone to do that when in fact the only time that typically matters, that meaning party registration, is for presidential primaries. So you still have a decent number of people, particularly in those rural parishes, who technically are Democratic, but they haven't voted that way in years. So yes, it does come from those two drivers that I've described. Oh, actually, I'll do this in this. Okay, John.
Along those same lines, I know going back about 15 years, there's been a lot of increased activity towards voter registration drives, especially among African Americans. How have the numbers changed for African American voters in Louisiana? Do you have any of those stats?
So the question is about voter registration drives as it pertains to black voter registration. And actually, I'll go back even further than that to answer your question. The first time that I saw a spike in black voter registration in Louisiana was in 1991. You remember that what happened way back then was that you had the combination not only of the Edwards-Duke runoff, but also the fact that I think it was 3 days into the runoff was the voter registration deadline to be eligible to vote in that November runoff. And that's when you have the 60,000 people who were patiently waiting in line to register to vote to be able to participate in the runoff. That was the first time that I saw black voter registration spike. Since then, black voter registration has been on the steady increase with occasional spikes, such as when Cleo Fields was running for governor, number one, and number two, I saw a period of time from about December 2007 to the fall of 2008, which to me was the candidacy of Barack Obama, which also increased black voter registration in Louisiana. So what was perhaps about a quarter of the electorate a generation ago, right now is sitting at about 31%. Here in East Baton Rouge Parish, it's 43%.
Could I get you to possibly speculate on who you may believe may be the three strongest possible Republican contenders to defeat Governor Edwards, and maybe get a real big positive and negative that may be associated with those top three?
So the question here is about evaluating the Republican candidates who may or may not be running against Governor Edwards next year. And I'll try to give some general pros and cons because, of course, one of whom I had worked for in 2014, so I'll try to, All right, so we'll start with John Kennedy. He is, of course, the incumbent U.S. Senator, which is an advantage and a disadvantage because, of course, he just got elected. I would imagine that Governor Edwards' people would make that the first line of attack against him, is why he wants to come back home so soon. Even though John Kennedy certainly is very verbally adept and good with the quip, that is a concern that he has to address. Plus the question of, does he really want the added scrutiny that goes with being governor as opposed to, as U.S. Senator, the Capitol Press Corps loves him. So that's certainly a challenge that Senator Kennedy has. Then we go to Congressman Ralph Abraham, who is evaluating his options. And the trickiest thing for Congressman Abraham is that he is from North Louisiana. So what that means is that and the thing I've seen too, when you're talking about a North Louisiana candidate, is that Northeast and Northwest Louisiana kind of tend to do their own thing. In other words, if one is from one side, that doesn't mean the other side would necessarily support a candidate. That's something that John Fleming found out the hard way in the 2016 Senate race. So Ralph Abraham's challenge is he has a sprawling district that does touch into the Baton Rouge and New Orleans media markets. He also has to make himself better known there because, of course, 55% of the vote is cast in Baton Rouge and New Orleans media markets alone. Getting elected governor from the strength of the Monroe and Alexandria media market, that's not enough. So obviously he has to expand his name recognition, and I would argue that that's his greatest challenge. I also think in his favor, he would not be a candidate who lacks for funds, and he has a very good personable manner. When you're talking, I'm going to throw in a third candidate, and this goes into the potential impacts of the 2018 midterm elections. Steve Scalise. If you are talking about Republicans being in the minority in the House, there is one less leadership position as a member of the minority party than there would be in the majority party because, of course, you don't have a minority speaker. So that means there's some choices that Steve Scalise has to make. Does he gamble on the Republicans taking back the House in 2, 4, 6, or 8 years? or does he really want statewide office more badly? So that's of course his challenge. I can tell you I think that he would be a strong candidate. He has the advantage of coming from a media market which casts a third of the state vote. And he has handled himself very well in the wake of last year's very unfortunate incident. So all those things work in his favor. It's really just a question of where, the old question they ask you in job interviews about where you see yourself in 5 years. That's certainly an issue that he has to address. So that, like I said, that's what I see as kind of the pros and cons of the 2 to 3 people who could be running for governor's Republican. Yes, sir.
With the open seat right now, and a lot of Republicans, have you heard any influence about any Democrat qualifying? And have you heard any influence about possibly anybody other than the last Democrat that ran, or their influence possibly concerning that? Any Democrat other than
So the question is about the quote-unquote open seat, which I assume you're referring to the Secretary of State's election to be yes. I've heard legislators. One name I heard tossed around would be Senator Gary Smith of Norco. Also, too, when you're talking about handicapping who could possibly run, you have a lot of people in leadership positions who are term limited in 2019. And potentially they could run for this office if they wanted to. And in fact, I saw a similar thing happen when Fox McKithen's tenure came to an end as Secretary of State and we had a special election in 2006. That was the first time that term limits were in effect because of all those people who were going to be termed out in 2007. And you in fact had several people, including our own Jay Darden, who were running purely because their political careers were otherwise going to come to an end in their respective legislative chambers. So I would expect Democratic legislator or legislators to run this time. There's also, I would say, 3 to 5 Republican legislators who would be looking into making the run as well. So it has the potential for being an interesting race. Here's another little data point I thought that I would share with you regarding the fall election. So I actually have had a debate with a political operative on Twitter about the turnout this fall, with the idea being that turnout was so abysmal in last fall's treasurer's race that abysmal turnout would carry into this fall. There's something a little different about this fall that was not present last year, and that is we're talking about congressional races being on the ballot. I went all the way back to 2006, which was the last time there was a midterm election in Louisiana where there was not a Senate race in the ballot to bring the turnout into that 40 to 50% range. What I saw happen in 2006, and by the way, this was at a time that you still had displaced New Orleanians, 33% statewide turnout. In other words, more than twice the turnout of what it was for the treasurer's race. So I would expect a somewhat more robust turnout this fall than what we saw last year, because last year was an off year in every sense of the term, and it was very hard to get voters engaged. But with congressional races and a couple of legislative special elections and school board races and mayoral races and so on and so forth this fall, I would expect a somewhat more robust midterm type turnout this year. Yes?
Since I got you to bite on the last one, and you mentioned Kennedy's potential vulnerability to what you just got up there, let me ask you this, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being not very, well, it wouldn't be much of a attack, 10 being probably a pretty strong vulnerability to it, how would you rate 2 particular issues on incumbent Governor John Bel Edwards? Number 1, his emphatic statement leading up to the election that he would not raise taxes, and number 2, him having gone to the Louisiana State Supreme Court in an effort to say that transgender folks should be able to use the restroom of their choice. One economic policy, one social policy.
So the question is assessing Governor Edwards' vulnerability on a 1 to 10 scale, with 10 being most vulnerable, on an economic issue, which would be the promise not to raise taxes, and the social issue, which would be about transgenders. I'll start with the social issue. I don't think that would be a very hot button issue. I'd give it a 3 to 5. It's the kind of issue that's salient to the contingent of religious conservatives, but not much beyond that. Plus, for it to be more towards a 5, you'd have to assume that litigation would be ongoing and making the paper every day, or alternatively, there being a lot of TV and mail communications on that issue. So that's the social issue. The economic issue, the way I would assess that is this. It's certainly a challenge for Governor Edwards on the taxing issue, because once you have that footage, it's very easy to use that over and over again in commercials. What has to happen, though, for him to be vulnerable on the tax issue, and again, I'll give him a 5 on this one, and I'll tell you why. So, a lot of the quote-unquote damage when you're talking about increased taxes occurred in 2015 and 2016. When you're talking about an election in 2019, the impact of that damage recedes further and further into the past. The thing which I think could trip him up would be, depending on what ultimately gets decided in the legislature in terms of new taxes that would get added on, that could be a vulnerability. But at the same time, he can also point out, given that the sales tax renewal is a very strong sticking point for the Legislative Black Caucus, Governor Edwards could just as easily say that he supported reducing taxes, i.e. the falling off of those temporary taxes from the rolls or the books. And if you want to really get partisan about it, he could also say that those taxes were the Republicans' fault, and that, you know, now we have low unemployment and I've taken those sales taxes off the books. So to me, for there to be a vulnerability, if let's say you had something like, say, a lot more things subject to the sales tax, and or say taking away of the itemized deductions, or if we really want to get into the politically not going to happen, increasing the income tax. Those kinds of things, and I've actually done some polls on various kinds of taxes, their palatability and lack thereof. Income taxes are the absolute worst thing to try to get voters to agree to. If you're talking about the backdoor income tax increases, such as taking away exemptions and credits and all that, voters don't quite get as upset about that. So like I said, it all depends on what the ultimate strategy is as to what gets added to the tax burden, as opposed to talking about the taxes that are going to fall off.
One other question, and I'll ask it. We have time for one more.
Mm-hmm.
Other than disinterest, why only 11% turnout in the parish to vote on the school proposals last weekend?
I would say two things, and I'll give you the answer I'm not supposed to give, which is disinterest. But the other thing too, when you're talking about those kinds of tax elections, you have to remember that as much as you and I and everybody in this room love politics, the reality is there's only a certain amount of interest the average voter has. And so subjecting that voter to an endless series of tax elections is a recipe for very low turnout. So when you're talking about a spring election when there's more important things in people's minds, such as baseball games and all that, to worry about, it's kind of hard to get them enthused about a tax election, particularly one where, number one, not everybody in East Baton Rouge Parish was affected by it. Number two is a renewal. So there's not exactly the emotional factor to a tax renewal as there would be on a new tax. In fact, I remember, I want to say it was the 1998 when those taxes first went on the ballot, and or the Alive bond proposal in 2009, I recall seeing turnout in the 30 to 40% range because, of course, not only were they controversial issues, but you're talking about new taxes. A tax renewal in the off-season doesn't really generate much excitement. Plus, there really wasn't anything else on the ballot, so the combination of those two things. I'll throw in a third factor. A lot of times for these tax elections, there's not a ton of awareness that there is, in fact, an election being held. Now, some of the affected groups, in my opinion, did a slightly better job this time than in past elections, where I actually saw signs going up around South Baton Rouge regarding the police millage and the school tax millages. But other than that, there's typically not a lot of awareness that there is an issue, that there is an election, because a lot of people don't have those election dates memorized. So, like I said, a combination of all that, I think, was what contributed to the very low turnout.